Well, welcome to all of you for joining our webinar this afternoon. My name is Abraham Kim. I'm the Executive Director at the Council of Korean Americans here in Washington, D.C. We are happy that all of you can join us for this timely webinar examining the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our global economy, the outlook for the U.S. economy, especially with this new $2 trillion stimulus package, and three, what we should anticipate in the coming months as countries and economies recover. And if that wasn't enough, there is another disruption going on in the energy world with the Saudis and the Russians in an oil price war when global demand is dropping precipitously. I'm sure you'll all agree we have much to discuss today with our distinguished guests. But before launching into our conversation today, we have numerous people online in our online audience. We'd love to know where you're connecting from. So in the chat box below, please put in your city. Last time we did this webinar, we had people connecting as far as Ireland. So I see Columbus, Ohio, welcome. Rock Creek, Montana, welcome Montana. Los Angeles, Minneapolis, Pasadena, California, DC, Portland. Well, welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. At the final half hour of our conversation today, we want to include our audience into our discussion with your questions. So if you are using Zoom to join us, you'll find the Q&A button down below where you can send us your questions, and my staff will be collecting and monitoring these questions and passing them on to me to ask our speakers today. And if you're joining us from Facebook Live, please use the comments section for your questions. Well, today we have invited two guests on this webinar from the global political risk firm Eurasia Group. My first guest is Meredith Sumpter. She's the head of research strategy and operations at Eurasia Group. She's responsible for managing and driving the global research platform at the firm. And second is Robert Johnston, or better known as RJ. He currently serves as the managing director of the Energy, Climate, and Resources program at Eurasia Group. And he also serves as an executive advisor to the firm. Both are top-notch global politics and global markets expert and are familiar faces on many international media channels, sharing their insights about business, financial markets, and geopolitics. We're honored to have them both. But before we get started, I wanted to turn the camera over to RJ to talk a little bit about Eurasia Group and how they are looking at these issues. And then I'll turn over to Meredith, who will give us a couple minutes of comments about the macro situation currently. And just a quick note here, Meredith's camera is not on, so it's not on your side in the audience. You'll see Meredith's name, but you'll see both RJ and my image. So with that, RJ.
Abe, thank you very much, and greetings to everyone who joined the WebEx this afternoon. And thanks to Abe, our former Eurasia Group colleague, for arranging us, inviting us on this call and giving us a chance to connect with all of you. So I thought it'd be useful to briefly introduce Eurasia Group and give you a little bit of background on how we look at an issue like COVID-19, because our business motto is politics first, which really means that we look at politics and its implications for business and for financial markets. So we have a staff of about 75 analysts who cover about 100 countries around the world, working for our founder, Ian Bremmer. And our job really is to provide insights that are both forward-looking and market or business relevant on the big political trends. Whether it's a global crisis like COVID-19, whether it's elections or policy or legislation or security issues, we cover those issues around the world. So when it comes to something like COVID-19, we have inputs from our colleagues in our offices in London, Tokyo, Singapore, Brazil, and trying to build together a global view to help our clients. Our client base is mostly split between big institutional investors, but also across the whole value chain of the private sector, working with companies around the world as well. So just wanted to give you a little bit of background on who we are and how we approach these issues. So I'll hand it to my colleague Meredith to give you a little bit of what are some of our key takeaways on COVID-19 so far?
Thank you, RJ, and thanks to Abe Kim and the Council for Korean Americans to having us on. So look, I just wanted to provide a few comments to give you a sense of how we are thinking about coronavirus and its likely impact. And what I would say is at Eurasia Group, our view is that we are really just at the beginning stages of the impact that coronavirus will have, not just on public health, but on the livelihoods and the economies of affected countries. This is really a once-in-a-lifetime shock, akin to the Spanish influenza at the turn of the previous century or a world war. And it really has the potential to fundamentally upend society in terms of employment and the social safety net. The private sector, we're just the beginning stages of seeing the far-reaching implications for supply chains and investment strategies, as well as implications for country stability and even global power structures. And in many ways, this is a much more serious crisis than the financial crisis in 2008. Back then, the financial resilience and baseline state of the economy was not as good as it is currently. But the political capacity in 2020 to coordinate effectively among global governments is now so much more challenging than it was in 2008. And as such, while we are seeing something of a robust quantitative ability of central banks and governments to respond, including the unprecedented $2 trillion package that's working its way through Washington this week, that's making markets rebound a bit. That's the good side. But the qualitative capacity to respond, the fact that governments and institutions are managing the virus differently and failing to really coordinate effectively, this is a much more intangible, but it makes us more cautious about a quick, or what we call a V-shaped recovery, as opposed to more of a longer term or U-shaped recovery. Last thought I would like to share is that this is really the first global crisis to hit a world that is now without strong global leadership. And this in many ways explains the myriad and uncoordinated manners in which country governments are responding to coronavirus, the weakened institutions, the WHO playing more of an advisory role. All of this will prolong the public health crisis and prolong the related detrimental effects on societies and economies. So in other words, even with robust fiscal packages and lower negative interest rates as central banks work to ease credit lines, we are cautious about expecting a quick recovery so long as the virus continues to spread. This is true globally, but it's also true here in the United States.
So thank you for that that assessment, Meredith, and thank you, RJ, for your introductions to Eurasia Group. I just wanted to ask a few questions as we dig deeper into these topics. I'm sure our audience have a lot of questions that they would love to ask, and we'll bring them in. But it sounds like, I mean, today we got very obviously the $2 trillion package went through. It's going to be voted on by the House in, I believe, on a Friday. But also we've been getting a lot of negative numbers coming through, while on the other hand, our government officials are trying to say that perhaps this recovery will be fairly quick. I mean, today we got the number of 3.3 million people, numbers on the jobless claim front. But we have folks like Fed Chief Jerome Powell, who did say that we are going into a recession, but the economy is fundamentally sound. How do we reconcile these kind of mixed messages that are coming in from folks that should be, I guess, providing for us hopefully a transparent view of how the economy is going, but we're seeing signals that are the contrary. Meredith?
Yes, sure, Abe. So look, our central banks and our governments are really working in overtime to provide the necessary monetary and fiscal stimulus to assure markets and to keep economies functioning during this challenging time. What's unique about the virus and what makes it different from, let's say, the shocks that came after, the financial shocks that came after 9/11 or even the 2008 financial crisis, is that it is causing both a supply and demand constraint on companies, on businesses. It's the spread of the virus that is going to lead us to understand the duration of the economic dislocation that we're likely to see because of it. So as long as that virus is spreading, we are going to see communities that will have to undergo constraints, whether that's social distancing, whether that is more containment measures. Again, these decisions are being made more so differently by individual country governments. And here in the United States, these are decisions that are being made differently across state and local governments. So that haphazard approach to trying to contain the virus. On one hand, I think you hear federal officials saying, well, this is experimentation. You know, we don't want to see the economy come to a full stop. It's incumbent upon us to social distance and take necessary precautions to be able to stop the spread of the virus, but we can't see the economy come to a full stop. And I think that's the messaging that you've really heard out of Washington over the past week. Public health officials, however, are saying that you really have to take more stringent measures that will have negative economic effects on our companies and our workers in the short term, but that is necessary to actually stop the spread of the virus. And that's the debate that you see happening. Financial officials, government officials are working hard to provide the necessary fiscal monetary stimulus, trying to keep those economies going and the businesses open and people paid. But on the other hand, the global public health officials are saying the spread will continue unless we take even more stringent measures akin to what we've seen in China and other locales. So that's a debate that will, continue. But I think bottom line for our listeners, so long as that spread is happening in the United States, and so long as we are not on top of reducing that spread and we have new cases coming each day, we're not going to be able to work towards economic recovery. So right now, the United States is just shy of 80,000 cases. We're number 3 in the world behind Italy and China in terms of countries with numbers of cases. We have over 500,000 cases worldwide. Most global public health officials are now looking at May as potentially the period in which the US will peak in new cases. And so our view is, if you're listening to the public health officials, it's going to be until May before we can reduce some of the more stringent social distancing and containment measures that are impacting businesses.
RJ, I'm part of this is that we're looking at the United States, but really the United States is part of an international community, and it seems like we're in the middle of this, but there are places like the developing world that has not, there's still not a lot of cases there, but perhaps that's because there's not enough testing in those areas, right? But in places like population centers, like we just saw in the news about Prime Minister Modi, right, in India, putting some stringent lockdown. And if maybe perhaps the US gets through this, and maybe at the tail end, but there may be, during that time, there may be a ratcheting up of crises in places like India or the developing world that would have a reverberation effect on the United States and its ability to recover. How is Eurasia Group in terms of putting all of these pieces together, where the United States is really part of a bigger, global market that's all being impacted at different times of these with these various pop-up diseases in various parts of the world?
Yeah, I would return to something Meredith mentioned in her introductory comments about the G0 world and the uncertainty globally about international leadership, about the America First policies, and about the US commitment to the so-called liberal international economic order, things like the United Nations, NATO, the World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, the UN climate process. We've seen a number of countries pursuing more nationalist, populist type policies. And I think Eurasia Group, in our top risks that we publish every year, has said that this is really about a geopolitical recession, right? That the post-Cold War order with the US as sort of the leader of international institutions, the key manager, the key global policeman on global issues, has started to change in the last 3 or 4 years. And as a result, we've seen a lot of regional issues and even global issues that have become quite serious in the geopolitical side. All that was happening at a time of very strong economic growth. So we had a geopolitical recession in a G0 world, but we also had pretty big global economic growth. The problem now is that we still have those sort of weak and uncertain geopolitical conditions, but now we're going to have an economic shock as well. So, what does that mean, like you said, for the countries we're talking about that are what we call fragile states, right? So we had India in our top risk this year because President Modi, Prime Minister Modi in his second term, has opted for much more nationalist, sort of anti-Muslim policies and protectionist policies that have created a lot more uncertainty in India. That was before COVID-19. So now you add that on top. Obviously, for the audience here, South Korea already dealing with the unpredictable relationship with the North, with a difficult relationship with Japan, and now you add how do those trends, pre-existing trends, trade tensions with the U.S. get impacted by COVID-19 as well. So I think all these global issues that were part of the elevated high geopolitical risk environment before COVID-19 now are much more challenged when you add in these kind of economic shocks to it as well.
Let's bring in the oil question here. Earlier this month in March, obviously the Saudis and the Russians got into an international oil price war. Can you give us a little bit of sense of where we are on that and how it's exacerbated the global economic instability?
Well, as you know, this is my my wheelhouse, and I could give you an hour on this, but I'll give you the short version. I think right now, as Meredith said, we have a supply and demand shock in the global economy. We also have it in the oil market in particular. Demand at the end of 2019 was about 100 million barrels a day, which was the highest ever. Demand in the second quarter this year, in the context of shelter-in-place policies, of a near total shutdown of global aviation, massive drops in global gasoline, demand will be 75 million barrels a day. So from 100 million to 75 million barrels a day. So if you go to fill up your car, you'll see that gasoline prices are down pretty dramatically and will likely continue to fall. So the interesting question is that a good thing or a bad thing for the US economy? Right? Historically, we would have said probably since the 1970s that low gasoline prices are good for the US economy, good for the consumer, especially at a time of economic duress. And we would also say that when gasoline prices are low, consumers have more disposable income and actually tend to consume more gasoline. Basically, all those historic assumptions don't apply anymore because we now have the US shale industry, right? That the benefits that we get from lower gasoline are offset by the regional downturn we're going to see in North Dakota and Texas and Oklahoma, Louisiana, Alaska, Bakersfield, California, and on and on and on. Because, the U.S. is now the world's largest crude oil producer with 13 million barrels a day. So the fact that we've become the world's largest producer has put downward pressure on prices even before COVID-19. And the Saudis and Russians were basically cutting their production to make space for America's supply. Well, that all ended 3 weeks ago, and the Saudis and Russians are saying, we in OPEC and OPEC Plus, as they call it, including Russia, can't continue to cut our production, our market share to support the US shale. So we're going to start increasing our production and put pressure on the US to shut down their production. So you have 3 million barrels a day more coming from Saudi and Russia as they ramp up. And you have this massive 25 million barrel a day demand shock. So you have complete chaos in the oil market. And I think the Trump administration is trying to figure out how do we balance this? On the one hand, Trump, we know he loves cheap gasoline. He tweets about it all the time. On the other hand, his own key Republican states like Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana are going to be in economic turmoil here. So they'll try to reach out to the Saudis and Russians and negotiate some kind of truce in this price war. But even if that truce can be achieved, you're still going to have this demand shock and this really big buildup in global crude, right? Just like any other product, when demand is low, you build up huge inventories.
Mm-hmm.
If inventories get high, you have to shut in production. So happy to talk about that further, but this is certainly a very challenging time for oil. And bottom line, I think that even in a V-shaped recovery, the damage in oil is so bad that oil will probably lag the larger recovery in the global economy and U.S. economy.
So basically, it's going to be a downturn for the energy markets and industries in the United States, but also these countries that are producing and depend heavily on oil production for their own economy, and it'll impact the way that they can actually, I guess, address and navigate the current downturn in the general global economy caused by the
we talk about top risks and geopolitical shocks. I think for Saudi Arabia and Russia, the reason they can have a price war is that both of them have $500 billion or more in reserves to manage through this oil price war. It's a lot of money. That's Nigeria doesn't have that. Venezuela, Iraq, Libya, countries that are major oil producers but are also very fragile states or crisis states. So one of the implications of this COVID-19 crisis and the oil shock is that a country like Iraq, which we had in our top risks, which of course is very important for the U.S. foreign policy and has been, we've been involved in wars there in the last 25 years, is likely to go through a major crisis because Iraq won't function. It barely functioned at $60 a barrel. It's not going to function at all at $20 a barrel.
I see. Let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about the stimulus package that is going to be voted on Friday. Meredith, what's your assessment of the $2 trillion stimulus package and some of the actions that the Federal Reserve has taken to stabilize the economy? Obviously we've read about how adults will be receiving $1,200 checks in the mail and $500 per kid. And there'll be money available for small businesses, but I think it was $350 billion, and then $500 billion of government lending for distressed companies. Is this enough from your assessment? Will this get the economy back on track, or what's your sense?
Well, Abe, it's certainly a very important effort and signal that it sent to markets and to working communities that Washington understood the gravity of this crisis and was finally, after 2 months of really not responding much to what many in the administration on the healthcare side was correctly calling internally that, look, the pandemic is going to be coming our way. Washington was slow to respond, and just over the last 2 weeks, you saw that turnaround. When the president and when Congress began these negotiations, our call was that this third stimulus package would probably show up sometime in May. But just to give you a sense of how quickly all that changed, within a week, we went from May to April, and now it's going to be passed before we even get into April. And I think what that tells you is how quickly the situation on the ground is changing here in the United States. Just as we've been here during this webinar, I got a notice that the United States now supersedes China in terms of number of COVID cases, and the infection rate continues to go up. So this is really Washington realizing belatedly they needed to move, and they needed to move now. Now, for those of you on the call, it would be great for many of our working families to receive, $1,400 check, $500 per kid. I don't know about you, but that's not going to cover my monthly rent and groceries for maybe for 1 month for some working families, but certainly not for 2 or 3 months. That is probably more of the reality of what we are looking to face here at home. So it's an important start. I don't think that this is going to be the end of the fiscal or other stimulus that will be coming from Washington. A couple of key things here, though. This is truly an unprecedented stimulus bill. It's $2.2 trillion. This amount and the provisions therein would have been unheard of even a month or 2 months ago. And really that the bill continued to increase in size as negotiations dragged on through late last night to bring more Democrats on board. So we've got Treasury Department fund for loans to struggling businesses. That's $504 billion. And keep in mind, you know, Congress is going to be in recess. Following this, members will be unable to come back to Washington and vote until the virus spread there's more of a handle on it. As such, the Treasury Department is going to have, and the executive branch will have, a great deal of authority over how these funds are actually spent. We've got $377 billion for loans for small businesses, almost $300 billion on those direct payments to taxpayers that the Treasury Department hopes to process within weeks. There's other provisions in there: unemployment insurance payments, additional funding for state and local governments, for payroll tax relief, and emergency aid to hospitals and health systems. We think that the bill will be passed on Friday morning, with the president signing this soon thereafter, which will empower a large-scale federal response as evidence continues to mount of an economic slowdown here in the States. Bottom line, look, markets are happy. S&P closed up 6.2% today. They needed to see this kind of concerted action from Washington. Whether markets stay happy, I think, will depend upon what happens next. And the focus will really turn to implementation. And in conversations with staff and leading offices on Capitol Hill, members there are really focused on ensuring that the fiscal stimulus actually gets to those who most need it as soon as possible. So there initially was a debate over creating new channels versus using established channels to provide the funds to keep businesses open and payrolls made. And my sense is that the argument came down on preference for tried and true channels because there's just no time. There's no time to create something new. And there's always the risk when you create something new, it doesn't actually function the way that you intend it. So the staff know that they're racing against the clock. And time and again, in speaking with them, you hear stats like, they're aware that facts like small local businesses, they have enough cash on hand, typically for 15 business days. And that's just not enough time. So even if those funds are readily dispersed, I think folks will be focused on how effective are those funds. Are they getting to the small businesses to keep those doors open? Are they getting to the taxpayers in terms of unemployment insurance or being able to stay employed with those companies who can use those funds to keep those, if not the doors open, at least retain the talent, so that when we come on the back end of this public health crisis, you'll have companies, small, medium, and large, ready to get back to work and to forge ahead with business, which will be hard to do if they've had to conduct large-scale layoffs in the interim.
How about you, RJ? What signs or signposts will you be looking for, whether this really kind of hopefully injection of capital and support will see if there's a hopefully a turnaround in the economy?
So I think we're fortunate that markets have been willing to accept the vast expansion of liquidity and credit that not just the U.S. government, but the European Union, the ECB, the Bank of Canada, Japan, et cetera, have extended. And there hasn't been any real crisis in global credit markets, in terms of actually be able to fund this. I think what that does is shift the focus more towards an assumption that the liquidity will be there and that the bankruptcy, insolvency, and cash flow issues can be managed in the short to medium term. So what our clients seem to be tracking very closely is not just stimulus and credit conditions, but the actual key performance indicators on the health response, right? The fatalities, the number of new cases, the effectiveness of and coordination between Washington and the states, the deployment of ventilators and masks and first responders. So, the financial investors tend to be very data driven, and they're looking for that data and looking at it very closely, and have priced in, obviously, in the last 3 days, a very positive reaction to the fiscal stimulus, and which comes on the back of the monetary stimulus from central banks. So now I think it really comes down to the performance of the health sector, where we hope that the leadership and the resources will be in place to support a first effective response to the first wave. I suspect that some of the more cautious investors will keep some powder dry until they see about a second or third wave later in the year. And I think right now in China, the headlines are very positive, but there's still some concern about Hong Kong and certain parts of China. But no, I think investors have very much shifted their focus from the fiscal and monetary stimulus now back to the national health crisis.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we're getting questions rolling in as we speak, and one of the question is how has the global trade and foreign direct investment been affected by the pandemic? With the strain on supply and demand, have there been contractions or negative effects on trade and investing? It sounds like there's a bit of caution there, just based on your comments, RJ. And
two thoughts, and maybe Meredith has a thought as well. But I think, interestingly, in terms of physical trade of goods coming on ships from Asia to North America or Europe is actually doing still pretty well. And I know that because I can see that the demand for fuel for ships and trucks is actually almost normal, believe it or not. The oil market crisis is completely driven by jet fuel and gasoline. So I think you look at Amazon hiring and the grocery stores hiring, the Walmart's hiring, there still is that flow of goods to support. It's obviously shifting away from services towards goods, but investment's a very different story, right? I think that investments in big global projects, factories and energy projects and things like that were already declining, I think, in the last couple of years because of some of the uncertainty around America First and trade wars, and supply chains were coming under stress, especially in the US-China, but also in NAFTA with USMCA as well, and of course Brexit. So now you add the COVID-19, and many of our clients are asking, will we see reshoring, right, with a lot of the investment coming back to the US, or at least to Mexico or Canada or somewhere closer, more intra-Europe, intra-Asia trade, and less interest in these longer supply chains across the Pacific because of the pre-existing trade problems, and now adding in the uncertainty about these pandemics. So I think those trends are very much in flux. So Meredith, anything to add on that one?
Yeah. No, thanks, RJ. No, very insightful. I would just add a couple of points that largely align with yours. One is that we do see the effects of coronavirus accelerating what we call like a partial deglobalization of trade and investment flows with emerging markets, I think particularly at risk on the latter. And especially I think with the US-China trade confrontation, some of the decisions that US corporates are having to make about China, they're moving personnel, they're moving investments, they're moving supply chains. The coronavirus has really also added pressure to those effects. That being said, we don't see US companies abandoning China as a market. And we do see, even with the coronavirus, speaking to our corporate clients, they look at emerging market economies as a critical source of their onward growth. So what does this all mean? If you have supply chains that are less global, perhaps more robust, there's more redundancy, there's increased costs, but these companies are not going to abandon these critical emerging markets, in part because the future middle classes are emerging from those markets. And these individuals, they want choices, they want to consume. So even as we've seen a rise in protectionism, really since the end of the 2008 financial crisis, there's been a dramatic sort of increase in trade protectionism and trade moving toward more away from multilateralism and more so towards regional or bilateral trade groupings. At the same time, the volumes of trade continue to grow. And we would expect, we get through this blip with coronavirus, we would expect that would continue to be the case. So again, we see our clients thinking anew about how are they going to position their supply chains to be more robust, perhaps not as efficient, perhaps not as global, but they are going to innovate to find a way to service new markets and to attract new customers. And that's not going to change.
Thank you for that. Just some other questions that are kind of rolling in. Meredith, one person asked, how do you think the Economic and Financial Committee in the United Nations will be able to help out with this economic and geopolitical recession. Is there a role for the UN in helping to stabilize the global economy?
I think there would have been a stronger role for the UN in years past. And really, going back to the comments that RJ and I have been making about our changed geopolitical order, international institutions are not robust players in this crisis. They would have been more robust players 20 or 30 years ago. But we just don't see that being the case now. And this gets back to a geopolitical recession. We're changing global orders from what was a US-led order to what will be the 21st century order. And there's a raging debate within Eurasia Group as to whether that's going to be a global order that is dominated by the world's two largest economies, so that would be the US and China, or if we're moving towards a more multilateral order. But in the interim, the role that international institutions play, some of them, the IMF, the World Bank, more directly, and the WHO more directly critical than others. What we're going to have to see eventually is a reform of those international institutions so that they reflect the needs of our current 21st century realities, as well as they have a more thoughtful take in terms of the power balances. So that means we need to see more emerging markets that are at the table, at the decision-making table at these international institutions. In our current environment, we've been slow to reform those international institutions to make that the case. We also currently don't see some of the world's strongest economies and governments investing in those international institutions that would make them central to being able to address a global crisis like this.
See, I'd like to shift our focus on domestic politics. This year we've almost forgotten that this year is an election year, for example, and a lot of U.S. politics and the domestic politics, even before COVID-19, was very polarized. And now we have this this public health crisis as well as this looming economic crisis. How do you think the current situation is going to be shaping our domestic politics this year?
RJ, you want me to take that one?
Yep, go ahead, Meredith.
Okay. Great. So it's going to absolutely dominate. And I think what's interesting right now, we are watching the way that President Trump is digesting the crisis and what's coming and what it means. And I think in many ways it helps to explain his thinking. At first, it wasn't as big of a crisis here in the States as it was on the ground in other countries. He finally had to be forced to grapple with this crisis. And now he's grappling with the negative economic effects and the comments about wanting to have the US economy back open for business by Easter. I think that explains the underlying anxiety of what happens to the US economy, which was pretty darn robust ahead of this crisis. He knows that we are going to be in a recessionary environment, and that's not good for him politically. What's interesting, though, is that since the president has taken more of a hold of the coronavirus response here in the United States, we're actually seeing his poll numbers increase. So he's had a pretty, the US president, he has high disapproval numbers, but he has consistently also had very strong base numbers of the low 40s that hasn't really changed no matter what has happened over the past 3 years. In the last week or two, we've seen an uptick in support for President Trump among independent and self-identified nonpartisan voters. And in many ways, this could reflect a kind of what we call a rally around the flag approach, which is when your country is in crisis, you all come together. And the president is really speaking to that now. The challenge, though, even though he has the advantages of incumbency, The challenge for him will be just the duration of the public health crisis, which will also impact the duration of the related economic dislocation for both businesses and workers. That's going to get more challenging ahead of November. And I think that's the difficulties and the political realities that he's facing now.
RJ, do you have comments?
Yeah, I think that Eurasia Group's view had been that Trump is the favorite to get reelected. And that was based on two key assumptions. The first was that we'd have a strong US economy, and the second was that he'd be running against a progressive candidate. So both those assumptions are now in peril, obviously. And now, as Meredith said, I think the questions about his management of this crisis and the duration of this downturn, the difference between a V-shaped recovery and something much more extended will probably be the key factors determining the outcome here.
How about as countries are, and particularly in the United States, there's been some talk about how it impacts kind of the sense of nationalism, and there's been a growing sense of nationalism. Do you feel that? In your work, do you see a rise of the strengthening of America First at support and the sense of nationalism in the United States as a result of this crisis going on?
I think we've been tracking nationalism even ahead of the coronavirus outbreak, and we found sort of uptick of nationalism and sort of an anti-globalism that really was a reaction of populations more so in developed market economies versus emerging market economies that just felt like globalization was no longer really working for them. In many of these countries, there is certainly the risk that coronavirus could exacerbate that nationalism. But I think over the and certainly as these communities struggle with the related latent economic dislocation effects, and that's really truly a risk here. To counterbalance that, I think the crisis will lead those country governments that can afford to do so to spend even more on their social packages, to think anew about how they're going to have to renew their social contracts with their constituents. That could have some sort of alleviative effect, but people are going to go through a difficult time in dealing with the effects of this crisis. And we just don't see a return to more of a globalist approach in the near term.
RJ, you had a comment, or?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what Meredith's saying, I think nationalism and populism, you can see some of it in Trump's response about this is a Chinese virus, right? Sort of amplifying the issues at the border, at the homeland, which has been a critical part of his political strategy. But one of the things we do at Eurasia Group is it's not just about the US, right? This is something, these same populist concerns about migration, about borders, about the kind of economic dislocation that Meredith described from globalization, now disease and pandemics, all filters into this anti-globalist movement, which supports the rise of populist parties and leaders in a number of places around the world. Brazil is an interesting case study, not to belabor that, but just that President Bolsonaro, sometimes described as the Trump of the South, has been even more out there than Trump in terms of saying that this is all a hoax and there's no reason to change your behavior or keep shopping and all that stuff. So that's an example of that sort of populist leaders tying this back to that anti-globalist, very deep feeling in a lot of these countries.
Well, thank you. We're getting close to our 5:30 mark here, but I wanted to give each of you a final comment to our audience about, just maybe a sense of what to look forward to in the coming months, and hopefully a little bit of hope in your messaging, because all this last 45 minutes has been pretty. I know we're at the beginning part of this whole crisis. But Meredith, I'll turn to you first, and any final comments to our audience?
Sure, Abe. Well, thanks. I think what we're trying to make clear is that the next couple of months are going to be challenging, and that these really are once in a lifetime, unprecedented events that we will be struggling with both as a country, but also globally. But inevitably, we are going to emerge from this crisis. And as so often is the case, often it's the businesses who will lead the way out of it. We're already seeing the way that the private sector is stepping in finding creative ways to make needed donations, find ways to keep people on payroll, find ways to be part of the solution, even though they are facing stressed balance sheets. I think we firmly believe that companies and communities alike will make the needed innovations and automations and changes to not just survive this crisis, but to figure out how to emerge from it and to thrive, and find ways to implement necessary reforms so that we're positioned again to resume robust growth after we're able to get a hold on the spread of the virus. So my message is hang in there. We will get through this. But we do want you to have a pretty accurate understanding of how we see the effect of this crisis playing out both here domestically and globally as well. RJ?
Yeah, I think in my domain of energy, I think while this can be a very difficult time for the U.S. energy sector, I still think over the long term, the U.S. will bounce back. And I think that investors around the world feel more secure investing in the U.S. shale and in the U.S. Energy sector than they do a lot of other places around the world. And if anything, what the Saudis and Russians are doing right now at a time of global crisis makes investors even more wary. So yeah, you're gonna need some new business models, some more lower carbon, net zero emissions, environmental investments. You're gonna need some new financial models and clean up a lot of balance sheets. And a lot of shale producers will go bankrupt. But I do think that over the long term, the U.S. is going to continue to be a global oil and gas leader. And this crisis and the volatility it's creating, we actually have a lot more flexibility and dynamism in our industry than really any other country for oil and gas. So I think there'll be a bounce back there. It's just that I think it could take more of that sort of 1 to 2 years versus the V-shaped recovery you might get somewhere else. More broadly, I think it'll be interesting to see what are the lasting effects of this on work, right? We're doing this call on Zoom or WebEx. People, I know Abe and Meredith and I spend a lot of time on airplanes. Typically, we're not doing that now, but maybe we're seeing that these kinds of technologies can create efficiency and change and improve people's quality of life. So there may be some interesting changes that come from it on the positive side for everyone in that domain as well. So hopefully this has been a good conversation, and we'd be happy to continue with you all.
Well, thank you very much for both of you, to RJ and Meredith. We really appreciate your perspective and insights today. If some of our listeners want to follow your work and continue to follow you, what's the best way to connect with you, both of you, at the work of Eurasia Group?
Well, we're certainly all over social media. You can look at Eurasia Group on Facebook and LinkedIn, and our founder Ian Bremer is a very influential Twitter guy as well. So, and we're at eurasiagroup.net on the web. Okay,
great. Well, please help me thank our speakers by writing bravo or thank you in the chat box. And before we all sign off, I had just 2 quick points to share with our audience here. If you signed up for this webinar through our Google form, we'll send you an email in the coming days with the recording of this webinar for those who are interested to have a recording. And then also we'll be having more webinars from the Council of Korean Americans, and please check out our website at www.councilka.org. Next week we'll have a conversation with Congressman Andy Kim to talk about the $2 trillion package, as well as talk with some epidemiologists about the current state of the disease. So with that, thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers, and thank you for joining us today. Have a great day.